Good morning. Happy Tuesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right. Digging into a very busy Tuesday. We're going to go straight into today's Q&A. This is actually a part two with Teja. So Teja had a question for yesterday. This is another one that came off of the last Coffee and Coaches conference call. And her question was in regards to comparing the two archetypes, to the narrow ISA individual and the wide ISA individual. And for those that might be pushed all the way into a very late propulsive strategy, are we going to start to see some similarities? And yes, we will in regards to some of the muscle activity. But the reason that this is a valuable question is because we now start to see the difference between the archetypes in regards to starting conditions, the tendencies we should expect, and then how we're going to try to intervene under certain circumstances. So we're going to talk about foot position. We're going to talk about how to set up a split squat and what those differences may actually be. And so again, a very valuable question for a lot of people. So thank you, Teja, for this question. If you would like to participate in a 15-minute consultation, please go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com, and put 15-minute consultation in the subject line so I don't delete it. We'll arrange that at our mutual convenience. Make sure that you go to the YouTube channel and subscribe there so you get all these videos, and we will see you tomorrow.
And I just had another question. When you have an end game wide representation,
Yep.
if I know correctly, when the inferior glute max starts to bend the apex of the sacrum under.
Yep.
I'm just wondering if this is similar to butt squeezing or not, and you should be careful with the exercise selection, or like in an arrow.
Yeah.
Or is it a different type of inferior glute max activity?
It's not a different type. It's just a different starting condition.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if I started with a nutated, so if this is the base of the sacrum, if I started there and I do that, so I didn't move this representation,
Mm-hmm.
I just bent the other part under, right? Okay, so that's the end position there, okay? If I started here and then I did that, it wouldn't look the same, right? But the muscle activity, because I'm trying to compress the same space, the muscle activity, the strategy would be the same, but because the starting conditions are different, okay, the end appearance will look different. But if it's the same strategy, I have to take the same precaution against reinforcing it. So if I'm a wide and I have posterior lower compression, or I'm a narrow and I have posterior lower compression, it's highly likely I'm going to try to do the same thing at the end.
Okay.
Okay. So again, I don't want to close those spaces, okay, because they both create interference. I'm going to move my wide. I'm going to try to move my wide back towards a middle representation. Okay, because that's where their bias would be. I'm going to take my narrow and try to move them back to an early representation because that's where their bias would be.
So in this sense, what you said, when you have a wide and you would try to bring them back, would you, if I refer to the foot position, would you keep it more in the medial propulsion, more than not in such a negative tibial angle as you would keep an arrow?
So by their structure, they're not going to let you go all the way back like a narrow would anyway. So if you try to capture an early representation of a foot on a wide ISA individual, what you're going to see is the foot position relative to the hip is going to be a little different. Like the amount of knee bend to capture that early representation of the foot is not going to be as far away from the hip as, say, a narrow would be. Because the tibial position, they don't have as much tibial excursion as a narrow does. because the ER representations are early and late. They're going to be biased more towards middle. Hang on. Let me get my foot. Middle foot. Cool with that? Actually, let's do this. Let's flatten it out a little. Middle foot, okay? ER, early, ER, late. So the tibia moves back, right? So when I set up somebody's foot on the surface, and if I'm trying to get an earlier representation, which is to create, so they're all pushed forward, I'm moving them back. On the earlier, on the narrow representation, my early foot is going to have more tibial angle backwards. So the foot is going to be farther away from the pelvis as I set them up. Like if I'm doing like a hook lying activity or something like that, they're going to be able to represent a better early representation that is more ER'd. So the foot is actually farther from the pelvis on the surface if they're laying on their back. Do you follow? Okay. And so the wide guy, I still need to move him back towards his middle representation. So it's an earlier representation. It's still going to be in middle P. So his tibia is going to be like that. So his foot is actually a little bit closer to his pelvis in that setup, because he just doesn't have the same tibial excursion. He doesn't have the same degree of external rotation representation. So I just move his foot a little bit closer to his pelvis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just wondering what you described, that when setting up someone, let's say in a split squat position,
Yep.
their structure is already going to determine the
Yep.
tibial angle. Okay.
Yep. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely it is, for sure.
So in an arrow, I would just more play with the width of the stance, as opposed to narrow, as when I would play with how further apart they're in a side to side.
So the width of their pelvis is going to help you determine that, right? So yeah. Again, you've got a nice little guide there. So as the pelvis is orienting itself from the ER to IR representation. So wide or narrow, they go ER to IR in a split squat. It's just like to whatever degree that they have that capacity. So think about this for a sec. So when you're setting up somebody that's a narrow ISA individual, so let's look at the extreme narrow ISA, and you're going to put them in a split stance. One of the common errors with a split stance with a narrow ISA is they split their feet too far apart. Okay, because they can, right? So their ankle and foot excursion allows them to take a bigger split, and then when they try to lower themselves down into the split, they look terrible at the IR representation because they started too far apart. You got to bring them back in a little bit, and then they can capture the IR. So you kind of have to take away some of their tibial excursion when you're setting up the split squat. With the wide people, they tend to not split enough because again, they're force producers. They want to stay in this ER. So now you got to coax them out a little bit so they get a better ER representation at the beginning so that their IR representation looks better at the bottom. Okay. So it's just, and these are just subtle little tweaks that honestly, you just walk through the gym. You don't even have to know whether they're wide or narrow because you're trying to capture a certain representation as they move through space. You're just eyeballing it anyway. You're going to make those adjustments. We're just using the representations for clarity.
Yeah, I was just thinking when determining the position of the foot, I should help myself with the helical angle. So maybe an arrow has more space front to back while the wide has more from side to side.
You are correct. That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.